Wife's hidden relationship with husband's grandfather leads to tragic murder. On April 7, 2011, in a serene neighborhood in Tampa, Florida, a harrowing discovery shook the Wellington family estate. What began as a quiet discord between a young wife and her husband's elderly grandfather spiraled into a saga of blackmail, fixation, and, tragically, murder. By the time law enforcement arrived, the damage was done. Blood had stained the grounds, exposing a sinister relationship that had been shrouded in secrecy for months. The grim reality of Elaine Wellington's affair would stun the local community and ignite a scandal that caught everyone off guard. Elaine Wellington, at 23, had entered her marriage with Jonathan, hoping for a new beginning. She envisioned a perfect life in suburban Tampa, but it wasn't long before her marital bliss showed signs of fracture. Jonathan, only 25, was increasingly absorbed by his work, leaving Elaine feeling isolated and neglected. Their once vibrant love had grown cold and distant. Harold Wellington, Jonathan's 79-year-old grandfather, was a shrewd man who had amassed his wealth through strategic, often ruthless means. After losing his wife, he became more domineering, living lavishly off his fortunes. To outsiders, he appeared as the family's sagacious patriarch. However, beneath this facade, Harold concealed darker impulses that would soon draw Elaine into a perilous and corrosive ordeal she hadn't anticipated. On January 5th, the dynamics within the Wellington estate took a precarious turn. Elaine had always been apprehensive around Harold, particularly the penetrating gaze that seemed to scrutinize her every action, leaving her feeling vulnerable. That day, Harold confronted her in his study, a room adorned with ancient tomes and portraits whose judgmental eyes bore down upon her. Harold, ever perceptive, had uncovered Elaine's clandestine affair with a younger man from a neighboring town, a secret she believed was well concealed. Rather than express rage, Harold recognized an opportunity. Understanding the leverage he wielded, he stood in the dim, chilly study and coolly disclosed his knowledge of her indiscretion. His terms were stark. Elaine was to yield to his will or watch her marriage crumble. The threat lingered ominously, like a tempest poised to strike, suffocating Elaine. She envisioned Jonathan's devastation upon discovering the truth, envisioning how everything they cherished would disintegrate. Driven by desperation to shield her secret and preserve her life with Jonathan, she capitulated. From that moment, a covert and demeaning liaison commenced, one in which Elaine felt more captive than a willing participant. The ensuing days were torturous. By February 12, 2011, what began as sheer terror had evolved into a perverse routine. Elaine found herself compelled to rendezvous with Harold in clandestine meetings, each time convincing herself it would be the last. She attempted to pacify him, engaging just enough to prevent him from shattering her world. However, Harold's fixation deepened beyond mere domination. It seemed he harbored delusions that, in time, Elaine would reciprocate his fervor. His behavior underwent a chilling transformation. Harold's demands for obedience gave way to discussions of a future together, as if they were destined. He became obsessed with the notion that Jonathan was the sole barrier between them, insinuating through veiled comments how life might differ without Jonathan around. These insinuations were disturbing, yet Elaine tried to brush them off, convincing herself they were merely tactics to intimidate her into compliance. Yet, it was evident Harold was not merely fantasizing, he was scheming. He began undermining Jonathan subtly, casting aspersions on Elaine's fidelity with seemingly innocuous remarks that sowed seeds of mistrust. Harold, a strategist in manipulation, never directly accused her, but gradually, Elaine perceived a change in Jonathan's attitude. Jonathan's observance intensified, and the once effortless trust that buoyed their relationship eroded into suspicion. Elaine recognized Harold's hand in this, orchestrating their dynamics like a malevolent puppeteer. The strain of his machinations and the escalating fissures in her marriage began to engulf her, threatening to unravel everything she held dear. Every encounter with Jonathan served as a stark reminder of Elaine's precarious predicament. Harold frequently echoed this sentiment, asserting that Jonathan was unworthy of her and that their union was fated to fail. He portrayed himself as her savior, the only one who genuinely understood her plight. By March 2nd, 2011, Elaine reached her breaking point. Determined to escape the toxic entanglement, she confronted Harold with the intention of severing ties. However, Harold was not one to relinquish what he claimed as his own. As Elaine attempted to distance herself, Harold's composed facade crumbled, revealing a sharp, immediate backlash. He threatened to expose everything to Jonathan, vowing to shatter her life if she dared to leave. But more disturbing than his threats was his confession of affection. Harold no longer viewed himself as a manipulator. He genuinely believed he was in love with Elaine. This revelation horrified her, as Harold's obsession had deepened into a profound delusion. His fixation with Elaine surpassed anything she had envisioned. He tightened his influence over her and Jonathan, skewing every interaction to serve his ends. It became apparent that his ultimate aim was to dismantle their marriage. Elaine was left wondering whether this stemmed from a twisted sense of love or merely an insatiable desire to dominate. Elaine's existence turned into an incessant nightmare. Her days were consumed with efforts to preserve her marriage while enduring the omnipresent torment of Harold's control. The dread of potential exposure, the oppressive guardianship of a man who now viewed himself as her protector, and the burden of her own betrayal weighed immensely upon her. Harold's manipulations had reduced her to a mere shadow of her former self. As time progressed, the pressures mounted relentlessly. The affair, the deceptions, and the perverse affection all spiraled uncontrollably, poised to obliterate everything in their wake. By March 20th, 2011, Harold's psychological grip had completely ensnared Jonathan. The once easygoing Jonathan had transformed into someone distant, withdrawn, and suspicious. Elaine could see the change in his eyes, the way he scrutinized her, questioning even the minutest details of her day. The doubts Harold had sown were flourishing, and Jonathan's trust eroded daily. Though he never confronted her outright, his altered demeanor was enough to make Elaine feel stifled. In their shared spaces, the silence between them thickened palpably. Jonathan was no longer the man she had pledged her life to, and Elaine knew Harold was the catalyst. Emboldened by the discord he had orchestrated, Harold became more overt in his ambitions. In their private moments, he enticed Elaine with visions of a future together, free from secrets, where they could live openly without fear. Yet, Elaine recognized the grim reality. It wasn't affection driving Harold. It was a craving for dominance. He aimed to claim her completely, dismantling her life piece by piece until she was irrevocably his. As the days passed, the psychological burden began to unravel her. Harold's omnipresence, his ceaseless manipulation, and the web of lies Elaine maintained for Jonathan pushed her to her limits. She felt ensnared, with every conceivable path leading to her undoing. Staying with Jonathan meant facing Harold's wrath. Leaving would place her perpetually under Harold's control. The encroaching walls left Elaine feeling helpless and desperate for an escape. The tension escalated over the following fortnight. Each interaction with Harold grew increasingly intolerable, his obsession intensifying. He dangled before her the promise of a shared future, yet it was evident his true pleasure derived from the immense control he wielded over her. Elaine's grasp on her sanity wavered. The terror of defying Harold paralyzed her, yet the prospect of enduring his dominance was equally insufferable. Piece by piece, she felt herself fading, and the stark realization dawned on her that she could not endure this any longer. On April 5th, 2011, Elaine reached her breaking point. The relentless torment Harold had inflicted became unbearable. She spent the morning lost in a fog of despair, contemplating her entrapment, and by afternoon, she resolved to confront Harold once and for all to terminate the nightmare engulfing her existence. That evening, she arrived at the Wellington Manor, a residence that once exuded grandeur and comfort, but now only echoed her distress. She navigated to Harold's study, finding him at his desk, his demeanor calm and collected, almost anticipating the confrontation. Elaine wasted no time. She declared the end of their twisted charade, stating she could no longer live under his domination, that she was finished with his manipulative games. However, Harold dismissed her resolve. He reasserted his previous threats, taunting her with his control over her life. He coldly reminded her that if she dared to leave, he would annihilate her marriage, her reputation, and everything she held dear. His words were not only cruel, but meticulously chosen to render her powerless. In his view, Elaine was trapped forever under his sway. As their argument intensified, something within Elaine shattered. The accumulated months of fear, subjugation, and deceit overwhelmed her. Harold sat there, smug and self-assured, when she noticed a paperweight on his desk. Driven by a surge of unchecked fury, she seized it. With a blind, desperate swing, she struck Harold's head. The sickening sound of the impact reverberated through the room, and Harold slumped over, life ebbing away instantly. The ensuing silence was suffocating. Elaine stood motionless, fixated on Harold's lifeless form. The act was not premeditated, but irreversible. The man who had haunted her for months lay deceased before her, yet as the gravity of her actions dawned upon her, panic set in. She dropped the paperweight, her hands quivering uncontrollably, and retreated from the desk, her mind racing with the enormity of what she had done. The following morning, on April 6, 2011, Jonathan returned home early from a business trip. He discovered Elaine sitting alone in their bedroom, her gaze fixed vacantly ahead. She remained silent as he entered, and unresponsive to his inquiries about her distress. Unaware of the prior evening's events, Jonathan attempted to console her. But Elaine was engulfed in shock, her thoughts spiraling through the night's catastrophic turn. The death of Harold was unintended, yet she was now bound to its repercussions. Later that day, as Jonathan resumed his daily activities, a pivotal phone call was received. It was then that the police were first notified of the incident at the Wellington estate. An anonymous tip had reported a disturbance, but the caller's identity remained unknown. On April 7, 2011, police officers arrived at the estate and, upon entering Harold's study, were confronted with his lifeless body, his head wound dry from the night's bleed. The preliminary assessment concluded that Harold had succumbed to blunt force trauma, with evidence suggesting a violent altercation. By April 8, 2011, the investigation into Harold's death intensified. Elaine was summoned for questioning at the local police station. The detectives proceeded with caution, aware of the complexity surrounding the case. Elaine, still reeling and desperate to shield herself from blame, fervently denied any role in Harold's demise. Her answers were evasive. She feigned ignorance of the previous night's events and portrayed herself as a bereaved family member, overwhelmed by the sudden loss of her husband's grandfather. However, as the investigation progressed, law enforcement began to unravel the intricate web within the Wellington family. The peculiar dynamics between Elaine and Harold raised eyebrows among the investigators. They interviewed neighbors, family friends, and acquaintances, seeking any clues that might expose the unusual nature of their relationship. It wasn't long before small yet telling details began to surface. Neighbors recounted observing strained interactions between Elaine and Harold in the weeks prior to his demise. Some even remembered snippets of their heated discussions, though these had seemed insignificant at the time. By April 12, 2011, the police had gathered sufficient evidence to proceed. Elaine's persistent denials lost credibility. The discrepancies in her narrative were glaring, suggesting she was concealing key aspects of the truth. The investigation deepened, driven by a growing conviction that sinister activities had transpired behind the closed doors of the Wellington estate. This belief solidified as detectives delved into the family's history, uncovering an unusually intense closeness between Harold and Elaine. On April 14, 2011, they secured a search warrant for the Wellington estate and gained access to Elaine's personal communications, including her phone and computer. The discovered content further implicated her. A review of text messages and emails between Harold and Elaine revealed a disturbing scenario of manipulation and coercion. Harold had blackmailed Elaine for months, compelling her into an affair she was desperate to end. However, what truly alarmed the investigators was the extent of Harold's obsession. His communications not only displayed manipulative tactics, but also a perilous fixation on Elaine, with indications of his intent to permanently sever her bond with Jonathan. The revelations painted a clear picture. Elaine was ensnared, dominated by Harold, and saw no escape. Yet the correspondence also highlighted escalating tensions between them as Harold's death approached. Investigators were convinced that Elaine had been pushed to her limits by Harold's continuous abuse. While it was evident their final encounter had ended in violence, the complexity of their relationship added layers of tragedy to the investigation. By April 20th, 2011, the police had accumulated sufficient evidence to arrest Elaine. Forensic tests confirmed her involvement. Bloodstains on her clothing matched Harold's, and her fingerprints were found on the paperweight used as the weapon. The evidence was conclusive. Elaine had been present in the study at the time of Harold's death. Her arrest on charges of murder catapulted the case into the public spotlight. As news of her detention circulated, the media swiftly sensationalized the scandal, depicting it as a somber saga of love, manipulation, and murder. Public opinion was polarized, with some portraying Elaine as a cold-blooded murderer, while others sympathized with her as a victim of Harold's domineering control. The courtroom would become the arena for the truth. On May 5, 2011, Elaine's trial commenced, drawing a throng of reporters eager to cover the unfolding drama. The prosecution portrayed her actions as premeditated murder, arguing that she had killed Harold to liberate herself from his blackmail and oppressive grip. They meticulously laid out a timeline of events, utilizing months of manipulative exchanges to demonstrate Elaine's intent to extricate herself from Harold, culminating in the fatal confrontation. Conversely, the defense adopted a narrative of self-defense. They acknowledged that Elaine had ended Harold's life but depicted her as a long-suffering victim of his psychological torment, cornered into a dire situation with no apparent escape. The defense contended that on the fatal night, Harold had provoked Elaine beyond her breaking point. They argued that her actions were a spontaneous response to prolonged abuse, driven by fear and a desperate bid for self-preservation. The trial spanned 2 weeks, with both sides delving deeply into the evidence and testimonies. As the trial progressed, the public's views on Elaine's guilt or victimhood became increasingly divided. Opinions remained divided on Elaine's case. Some argued she was completely justified in her actions, while others condemned her as guilty of a crime driven by passion. By May 20, 2011, after several days of intense deliberation, the jury delivered their verdict. Elaine was convicted of voluntary manslaughter, influenced by the defense's portrayal of her acting under extreme emotional distress. The prosecution's accusations of premeditation, on the other hand, failed to resonate as strongly. Although found guilty, Elaine's sentence was mitigated by the factors of Harold's manipulative and abusive behavior. Jonathan, shattered by the revelations of his wife's affair and his grandfather's death, divorced Elaine following the trial. With no children to anchor their broken relationship, he remarried within 2 years. Elaine, meanwhile, served her reduced sentence, her life indelibly scarred by the tumultuous affair with Harold. Our channel features many more gripping tales of family drama with shocking outcomes, such as the tragic story of a housewife whose covert relationship with her father-in-law leads to a deadly conclusion. Make sure to like and subscribe to stay updated with our daily content. Don't miss our next video for more intriguing stories.